mute.
Hi, dear friends. This is another edition of The Water is Love Lives, conversations on the occasion of the launch of our documentary Water is Love, Ripples of Regeneration. Emily and I are here as part of the film team, and we are very honored and excited to be joined by two very distinguished guests today, who are formerly known as Eve Ensler, playwright, performer, activist, movement founder of V-Day and 1 Billion Rising. Hi V, it's such an honor to have you. And hi. And Alnoor Ladha, who's a dear friend of many years, a post-capitalist visionary, co-founder of Transition Resource Circle, co-founder of a community in Costa Rica called Brave Earth. Thank you so much for making the time to join us. And we want to discuss topics around the film, to honor water, and to mark the intersections of this work with, the wider struggles for collective liberation. And just want to start with the two of you, just to ask like a very simple question. What is your connection with water, or what was a special experience with water that you have that you might want to share?
You
want to start out?
No, you're my elder.
Oh, thank you for pointing that out. Um, you know, I was thinking last night when I came home from the city after this big, amazing meeting we had, and I got to the kitchen and I turned on the faucet and there was no water. And this panic started in me because I realized that if I'm in the presence of water and water is somehow running through my life, I feel there's a continuum and I'm connected to something much larger than myself. But when that ran out, it felt like I was stopped. I was suddenly not part of the river, not part of the ocean, not part of the whole ecosystem. And I think I am so privileged to live in the woods and to live on this land where water literally, I have a huge pond and then I have a lower pond, and all the water begins in the mountains and it runs through the forest and it runs down through this land all the way down to the valley where they're growing pot across the way. And there's something about having water running through your life that reminds you that water is running through your life. And it's really the mother's elixir. It's her manifestation of love. It is the greatest, it is the greatest manifestation of fluidity and possibility and resonance and continuum and eternity. And I'll talk more later, but when we disrupt that, and there's so many ways we disrupt that force, we actually stop being part of that continuum. We become isolated and we become alone and we become disconnected from that which we are. And so I just want to say, I love your film. It is so beautiful and it is so important. And it's so beautiful to see people all over the world expressing how they have come to love, hold, regenerate, and love water. And I think it's a practice that everyone should be engaged in. So I'm so honored to be here in service to that.
Thank you.
Thank you. And it's such an honor to have you.
Yeah.
So I live in the rainforest of Costa Rica, and so I'm embedded in the ecosphere of water. Um, I always have trouble with the word water. It just feels like an underwhelming cliche, which I think English does to most words of immanence and abstract beauty and the ineffable. You know, we have words like God, love, and water. Um, and many First Nations and First Peoples, when they introduce themselves, they also introduce the rivers and mountains and forests around them as part of who they are, because we are, of course, embedded within the ecology. And so I have the Children's Eternal Rainforest to my northwest, and that's where our water comes from, the springs of the Eternal Rainforest. I'm surrounded by Rio Chichagua to my north, um, volcano Arenal to my northwest, and the Peñas Blancas River to my east. I'm calling in from the northwest jungle of Costa Rica, in a place called Tierra Valiente, a post-capitalist experiment. So the land is in a trust, nobody owns it, there's no private property, there's no speculation on land, and it's an economic, cooperative, and organic farm. And my relationship with water, I grew up in a Sufi tradition, as you both know, Ian Martin. And one of the aphorisms that I grew up with is this notion of the body is the prophet, the Ummah is the prophet, the desert is the prophet, which is attributed to Rabia of Basra, 8th century Sufi mystic. And the sort of undercurrent of that aphorism is that, first of all, it's a heretical aphorism, right? Because in traditional Islam, there's only the one final prophet, which is Prophet Muhammad, may peace be upon him. And in the Sufi tradition, there's a disintermediated relationship with the divine. And so everything is Allah, and prophethood is found internally and externally, and is ever present. And so the first premise of the phrase is the body is the prophet. And I know V will talk more about that, and wrote a book in a beautiful play that I had the privilege to see in New York a few years ago, called The Body of the World. And so that's a self-evident premise, right? The body is the prophet. Our body knows what's coming and what's happening and how to tend as a microcosm of the whole. The desert is the prophet. The second premise is the notion that the ecology is prophetic. Our bodies do not exist in absence of that. They're interdependent, constitutive parts of the whole. And then the third premise, the Ummah is the prophet, is the community is the prophet, which is not just an anthropocentric community, but the community of the living, as well as the tribe of the dead. The ancestors, the living landscape, they're reflecting back to us who we are through our relationship with them, right? And how we honor and treat and pray and be in reverence to all that constitutes us. And it's not that the individual is necessarily the problem. It's that it's only a problem when we forget that the individual is constituted by a larger we. And so in many ways, even the word water and individual and ecology and community have a sort of smuggled in assumption of separation, which language itself is guilty of. And so, yeah, that's where I would start, and maybe open it for V if you wanted to talk about Body of the World. And of course, Martin and Emily, feel free to jump in at any point.
Emily, do you want to say something before I go?
Yeah, what you were just saying, Alnoor, really makes me feel about how much we are water in our bodies, right? And how much of our life is because of water. And so I'm just taking that in and feeling the water in my own body and the body of water near me, which is the Rio Tejo here in Lisbon in Portugal, and honoring the big rains that came and nourished this land and filled the lakes of Tamara. And yeah, just wanted to say hello to the water in my cells, in my own body. Thank you.
Martin, do you want to add anything?
No, I just feel a pleasant silence in my inner with what the poetry that was shared. And yeah, curious about your...
Well, I really love that notion of the body as the prophet, because I felt that my whole life. I really feel my body has known everything. And even though I didn't have the skills or the consciousness always to interpret what my body was knowing, it was far ahead of me. Like, I'll give you an example. When I wrote the vagina monologues, I wrote this character, I invented this character who was an older woman who had a bad sexual experience, and it really stopped her from having any more. And when she got to a certain age, she had all of her reproductive organs removed because she had a certain kind of cancer. And literally 20 years later, I got that cancer, right? The same cancer, and had all my so it was almost like I was telling the story of my body that was in the future but was in the past, which was all around. And I think I just want to say that for me, so much of my own journey, and I think just listening to all the stuff you were talking about in the film about the disruption of water and the degradation of water and the refusal of water and and just not letting it be its own flow, not letting it naturally flow. I think what happens, and I'm just going to, so much of my life is been a study, examination, a fight against rape and violence. And I never see them as separate, like the rape of women's bodies and the rape of the earth, because they are the same thing. And they're all about the death and the killing of the feminine and the death of killing of life force. And I think when you're raped as a woman, not only are you immediately disconnected from your body, which is the body of the world, but your flow, all that energy flow is completely disrupted, so that you aren't in your energy anymore, and you're not in the center of your heart and your power, and not power over, but the power to energize others and the power to feel. And I think for me, when I got very sick 15 years ago, it was the greatest gift I've ever been given, because I literally woke up after surgery with tubes and bags and everything coming out of my body, and I had a scar down the center of me like a river through my whole body. And I was in my body for the first time. There was nothing between me and my body. I was body. I was pure body. And everyone was saying, this is so awful. And I was like, this is the most profound mystical experience I've ever had. I'm in my body. And it took a kind of death, a kind of grave, intense happening to make that happen. But sometimes I feel like we're here with the earth, like this is the wake up. This is the moment that we can alchemize and transform consciousness. And I think that really began a journey that's still going on, of me falling in love with my body, and then really immediately falling in love with the earth, and then leaving the city and moving to the woods, and through plant medicine and other forces, surrendering, finding, loving, engaging, and realizing I have a mother, and she loves me, and I am her, and I'm part of her. And I think this embodiment has made me, I think something you say in the film, like, we're so afraid to touch how much we love the earth because that suffering is so painful, right? And I think to touch into that suffering, but also to realize how much you love the earth and to let yourself openly love, makes you a warrior. You know that is, you have to fight to protect her, to love her, to be her, and so I feel just living here in this land, which is so precious and so beautiful. It's been the next evolution. It's been the next evolution, and I'm so grateful for it.
Yeah, wow. Thank you so much. What a powerful story. Like I actually just want to breathe into it because there's so much in it. Also feel how it feels like there's a magic in it, of how the body itself is the healing. Like we often think about how do we heal the body, but it comes still from a certain detached mind. But yeah, that really speaks of a grace of life that so much just wants to embrace everything back into healing. Yeah, thank you. Very powerful. Alnoor, I also wonder if you want to add to this kind of the connection between healing landscape and healing ourselves on that same theme.
Well, I think it's becoming more and more self-evident, right? Even science, the younger brother of mysticism, is catching up to this understanding of there is a constant inner-outer mirroring, whether that's quantum physics and observer phenomena, or chaos theory, or Earth system science that's telling us that we live within a Gaian whole. And so how could there be inanimate parts within an animate whole? It makes no sense. And so the impoverished worldview of the West, which is based on what I would call like the unholy trinity of separation, materialism, and rationalism, that is sort of really the root of the meta crisis, right? It drives late stage capitalism, it drives patriarchy, it drives heteronormativity, it drives white supremacy, it drives able-bodiedness, it drives all of the psychotic isms, right, including fascism and authoritarianism and militarism. And it's based on the belief that we are separate and somehow superior. And within that hierarchy, of course, for 500 years, and now there's a nostalgic movement where the white Christian male is on top of that hierarchy, and everything else is the so-called other, right? And I see separation as the sort of peak of that pyramid, and then the materialism is this notion that we can reduce the entire world to its constitutive parts. Not only can we reduce the entire world to the atom, but the atom to the neutron, proton, electron, and now with quantum physics, the quanta or the photon or the Higgs boson or what have you. And that's the aim of science, to find the grand unifying theory of everything. That's why people win Nobel Prizes, because they can create certainty for the Western mind by reducing and compartmentalizing the world. And then the other side of the pyramid is rationalism. So not only can we reduce the world to its material constituents, we are entitled to do so with our limited Western socialized neocortex. And that domination and that imposition on the world is what's creating our separation. And so the way back, as V says, is through the body, right? And that microcosm, macrocosm, inner outer mirroring is how we sort of braille and grapple our way out of the impoverishment of the Western ontology and cosmology.
And can I speak to that? Because I think I'm so with you, of course, 100%. But I think one of the things I've been thinking a lot about is how, how medicine treats the body, right? And when I was sick, I had a very fortunate experience that I went to the Mayo Clinic, which is a much more holistic understanding of the body, right? But most ways that the body is treated is by specialists, right? So that you go and you get your stomach treated, but no one examines your heart, or you go and get your heart, no one examines what's going on with your legs. And I think part of this has made us believe that we are parts, right? That we are parts because we are being treated as parts, right? For example, they did research on chemotherapy, what it does to the body. They researched everything but the brain. And later on, they discovered that it has a huge impact on long-term and short-term memory, but it was like the brain wasn't part of that story because the brain wasn't considered as part of the body. And I think everything in our lives feels like that. I mean, I think our movements are siloed. I think the notion that we could separate out how we are treating migrants right now, and 26,000 children who are being held, for example, in detention centers without their parents, right? That we could separate that out from people being under rubble and babies and children being under rubble in Gaza, or transgender youth being so afraid to walk out of their houses. Like, this is one story. There's only one story. And there are many stories within that one story, but there is one story. And I think that division, that separation has allowed that white dominant patriarchy world of the demented fathers to really come to be, because we have been trained now we've been trained now to not see ourselves as part of this same story. And I think one of the things that the earth teaches you, and I have an earth ship that I sit in every day, and I go into and I ask the mother to take me, make me yours, teach me what it means to know you and be you. To open all the places in me that are obstacle and are blocking that, so I can be you and know you and be in service to you. And every day that I do that, there is someone new or something new that I connect to in the world and realize is my own, is me. And I think our work now, in the face of this rising fascist, tyrannical, predatory patriarchy, is to know the opposite is water. The opposite is flowing in that fluidity, which we all run into each other, right? It's one thing. And it's work that you have to really put your mind to, because the chip of patriarchy is so implanted, and the solidification and the separation is so implanted.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. It really makes me, like, what comes up in me when you share this overwhelming domination that we're all under is, how do we come out of that? How do we even notice the spark or the seed that's in us that is nourished by that water? And I'm curious what the role of art is. What is the role of ritual for you, to help us come back to that aliveness so that we can move through that and flow out into this feeling that you described of being connected?
Alnoor, do you want to talk about ritual and I'll talk about art?
Yeah. And maybe the confluence of the two.
Yes, yeah. Well, they're not even that separate, by the way. I mean, why another separation? Here we're doing it.
Right, right.
We'll call it art.
So the first thing I would say, when I look at what is deemed art, um, in the synthetic opulence of capitalism, most of it is narcissistic self-expression. And my sense is, if you are not contextually sensitive, you cannot become contextually relevant. And so what we brought forward with the genocide in Gaza and what's happening with the violent othering of immigrants in Turtle Island, and the fascism of basically every major Western quote unquote democracy, from Trump America to Putin's Russia to Erdogan's Turkey to you name it, um, is that most people are not willing to look in the face of the injustices and let that cultural context be the thing that informs their creativity, right? We see creativity as an entitlement, as we see most things in the West. And the opposite of entitlement is entrustment. There's a famous Sufi proverb where it's the great mother speaking to her children, and she says, "You are entrusted with everything and entitled to nothing." We've been gifted water, oxygen, the gift of life, 9 months in the womb, amniotic fluid, right? It's infinite list of endowments, but we're not entitled to any of it. And if we treat art as an extension of our entitlements, we'll continue to have the same shallow pop culture that reflects the impoverishments of the dominant culture. And so there's this line by Albert Camus where he says, an artist cannot refuse reality because they must give it a higher meaning. Right? The role of the artist is not to refuse reality, but to give it a higher meaning. And you can only do that by sitting with the trouble, being in the grief of what it is to be alive in late stage capitalism, right? Peak patriarchy, peak white supremacy, peak violence, peak war, peak extraction, but also peak possibility. And that's the role of both art and ritual. There's this line I received from a plant much smarter than me, and it said something like, Uh, if you do not have a critique of capitalist modernity, you are contextually irrelevant. If all you have is a critique, you're creatively and spiritually impoverished. So the first part is sort of to the pop art community and the new age and others who engage in bypassing what's actually happening on the planet right now. And the second part of it is really to the left in some ways, right? And it was speaking to the lefty anarchist in me, right? Which is the critique is the prerequisite, but it's not the final condition. We have to actively co-create post-capitalist realities worth living through creative spiritual praxis, which is always political. It's inherently political. There's nothing outside of the political realm, right? Enlightenment doesn't happen in a cave, it happens in the mouth of the lion, as the Buddhists say. That the notion that, like, even a Buddhist monk goes into the mountain to meditate, there's an entire economic, political, social, cultural apparatus providing that, right? Who's bringing them food? What ashram will they go back to? Who's funding that ashram? Where do their visitors come from? They're all flying on planes and interconnected with destructive globalization. And so it's all interconnected. And this idea that individual enlightenment is going to save us, the notion that comes from like the human potential movement of the 1960s and 70s, it's all part of the bankrupt narcissism that fraudulently calls itself culture. But cultures worthy of the word culture have always understood that none of us are free until all of us are free.
Yep. Well, as Terence McKenna said, the culture is not your friend, and I think, one of the things I've been thinking a lot about lately, because, I've had I've loved my life and I've loved my whole artistic journey, but it has been hard in America writing plays that speak to where we are and speak out of pain and speak out of grief and speak out of hardship, because it's not that people don't want it. It's that the capitalist consumer culture has convinced them that they want to be entertained into numbness and they don't want it. But I don't believe it's true, because my experience has been the exact opposite. Every play I've ever written where I was told it's too much, it's too extreme, it's too in your face, it's too all the language they use, it's too political, it's too didactic, name it. They have languages for it. My experience is no, actually, people totally resonate with it. And I think, I'm working on this new piece called Dear Everything, which is kind of this musical uprising around climate justice. And what I'm discovering is every time we do it, and it is pop music, but it's pop music that's been directed towards this moment. And pop music becomes different when it's directed towards the moment. It takes on a whole new layer of energy that rouses people because they love pop music, but something's happening inside them that's different. And every single time we do it, what I see is how much people want it, how much people want to be lifted, how much people want to talk about what's happening, how much people want to share what they're going through in this moment. And I think part of I don't know, I think the biggest journey is removing the demented father chip, right? It's just so implanted, right? Like the desire for approval, the desire for recognition, the desire to be somebody in that culture. We're so indoctrinated, embroiled in it, particularly in the West, And I think part of my journey has been like, do you want, I think if you ask most people this question, you could dissolve into oneness and become bliss, but lose your ego, but you would be in permanent bliss. Or you could be the most famous, most successful, blah, blah, whatever your career is, and make tons of money. What would you pick? And I will tell you, the majority of people in this country would pick door two. They would pick door two, because we haven't been trained. We haven't been brought up with a consciousness of understanding that to dissolve into that bliss is the point of our being here. It's to remove all the obstacles to that and remove all the things that get us entangled along the way, so that we can be part of what is part of us, right? That's what water is, part of it, because it is us. And that kind of that log, I don't want to use nature, that steel fence that got put down between us, between us and ourselves, is what we have to spend our time removing. And I think art that speaks into this time, that speaks of this time, that speaks of the curiosities of the time, of the disease of this time, of the suffering of this time, that removes that steel wall. You're all suddenly in the same room, engaged in the story that you're really engaged in, without that faux neoliberal, mask that we put on to keep part of that faux liberal world, And I think, how do we demask ourselves? How do we demask ourselves and feel like we may fall out of favor with the Father, but maybe that's exactly what we're supposed to do, so that we can fall into favor with the Mother, who is calling us every day at the top of our lungs, you know?
Thank you so
Wow,
much for all that.
that's, yeah. Emily, you wanted to go?
Yeah, I just want to say like that I think part of our intention with the film was also to help put people in that place of that kind of connection and love, and hearing that call of the mother and the call of the water. And part of the strategy was to do community screenings, to bring people together in the same room to watch the film, to have these conversations. And now the film is online, but we still want people to come together and create spaces where they can build that entrustment and find that place of service. So yeah, that's just what it reminded me of, and our service to this art of a film and storytelling. And yeah, I just really see that reflected in the film that we created, and our intention for it. Yeah.
Well, you succeeded.
Thank you.
I wonder also, because now so much, so you have mentioned already so many powerful, brought in so many powerful lines, and speaking to the role of art and ritual and animist practice, healing practice. And I wonder if you could also kind of zoom out from here and kind of contextualize a little bit in the, like, where do you see this work on the spiritual, but also the reconnection with the living body of Earth, kind of in the context of activism as it's now, like in the attempts for system change. Yeah, what do you see as the significance of this, and where we are also in our story as we confront, as you say, like this hyper-aggressive fascist patriarchy now?
You want me to go?
Yeah.
So I mentioned the word ontology before, right? And for those who are not familiar with the term, it's a branch of philosophy that discusses the reality of the world. What is reality? The isness. And onto comes from the Greek word vision. So it's literally how we see the world. And I would argue that the manner by which we approach is more important than the thing we think we're approaching. And if the dominant ontology is one of separation, materialism, and rationalism, there are other ways of knowing, being, relating, sensing, and feeling with the world. And to just take one of them and say, we can overlay it in some ways over the unholy trinity, right? We're not trying to amputate separation, materialism, and rationalism. Of course, we are in our separate bodies temporarily in having that experience. There may be one of us here, but we're having a distributed cognitive spiritual experience. And there is a material reality that we can interact with. And there is a role for rationalism. And even with science, I think of science as like the floor of understanding rather than the ceiling of understanding, right? It's one way to see the world that if we're using scientific method, we can agree that it is a circular logic, right? We create the premises that must be fulfilled in order for X or Y or Z to be considered scientifically robust. And there's usefulness in that. But we can overlay another ontology, almost like a Merkaba. And so the antidote logic, let's say, to separation is interbeing. and understanding that the I is constitutive of many other I's, human more than human. That we are an amalgam, we are assemblages. The antidote logic to materialism is animism. Everything is alive in a living organism of Gaia that is embedded within the living organism of the solar system, which is embedded in the living organism of an expanding universe. And the antidote logic to rationalism is relationalism. David Abram in The Spell of the Sensuous has this beautiful line where he says, there is no objective truth with a capital T. There's only the quality of my relations. By allowing the polyculture of ideas, right, all these other cosmologies, these other ontologies, what we do is we create space for more meaning, not less meaning. Right? The logic of capitalist modernity is one of monoculture. Right? If we allow the system to go on as it wills to, we would all have, you know, Apple computers and Microsoft Office and be wearing Nike shoes and listening to Miley Cyrus or Beyonce or whatever corporate capitalism wants us to listen to. And the antidote logic to monoculture is polyculture, right? Many ways of being, many tongues, many approaches, many cosmologies, many ontologies. And so I don't see activism evolving without shifting the ontology. Because what we end up doing, and you know, I've also, of course, been guilty of this, is replicating the us versus them binary. And so when we allow the oppressor to inform our response, we end up emulating the oppressor. And we see this a lot in traditional activism, where unhealed archetypes play out their traumas and their unconscious biases, etc. We've all seen this in movement spaces. And in some ways, like modern activism as we know it, whether that's protests or artivism or whatever, are replicating the ontology of the dominant system of materialism, separation, and rationalism. And so what I think about is, well, what do liberation ontologies look like? What does it look like to have ontological shifts central to the spiritual political praxis of social justice work? And there's no definitive answer. There's no one way to do it. My sense is, by being good students of the culture and really understanding the impoverishment of the dominant culture and its socialization, entrainment, and conditioning of our desires, hopes, beliefs, pattern behaviors, conditioned tendencies, etc., we can then start deschooling and deconditioning and decolonizing our heart, mind, spirit, psyche from those pattern behaviors. And then the logical outcome becomes we become conscientious objectors of the dominant culture, because we've you know, it's like almost homeopathic medicine. We take enough of it not to paralyze us with you know, grief and inaction and despair, but we take enough of it to start to understand what the antivirus could be. And and it's ongoing work, right? It's perpetual. There's no such thing as a decolonized person, right? It's an ing. And as we engage in that practice and we become conscientious objectors of late stage capitalism, then we start shifting our behavior and we start declaring to the living world who we are and what our values are and what we stand for. And so the idea that you could have spiritual practice outside of that, it makes no sense, right? By going into my individual spiritual practice, what I'm saying is I'm trying to become impervious to the suffering of other beings. And that's only going to get me so far. That's going to, you know, direct me into one set of positionalities. But when I declare to the living universe that it matters what's happening in Gaza, right? It matters what's happening to our waterways. It matters what's happening to indigenous peoples and cultures around the world. It matters what's happening to female bodies. It matters what happens to trans bodies and queer bodies. Then the living cosmos can respond, and then superpositions of possibility, vistas we couldn't even imagine, are open to us. So it's an emergent process. There is no blueprint. There is not going to be, two smart white Europeans like Marx and Engels going into a room and writing the manifesto for post-capitalism. Those realities have to be created. Those cultures have to be created, and it doesn't take, three of us could be creating embodied post-capitalist culture, and it's like a contagion. It mimetically spreads, and so we have individual, communal, and societal responsibilities to be good citizens of our times, rather than the citizen subjects of the empire who just want good jobs and nice cars and live in nice houses and try to hold their comfort as long as we can, right? That's an insane strategy on a dying planet.
That's beautiful, Alnoor. Beautiful. I would even go as far to say that I don't want to be a conscientious objector, because it still keeps patriarchy as the base, as the thing we're responding to. I want to just create the new world now. But I'll say something what I mean by that. I wrote a book called The Apology, because for years and years and years and years I kept waiting, thinking that my father, even after he was dead, by the way, I would go to the mailbox thinking he would send me something in the mail. I kept thinking there's going to come this moment when he's going to come to consciousness, and malignant narcissists, that just doesn't happen. And it's something we should give up believing is going to happen, because their malignancy makes it impossible for them to even want to be conscious, right? And so I finally decided, like, I'm not going to get that apology. I'm going to write it. I'm going to write it to myself. I'm going to climb into my father, because so much of my life up until that moment was in reaction. My existence, my identity was in reaction to patriarchy, being that conscientious objector in a certain way. And I realized I wanted another story. Like, I didn't want to be in that story anymore, which was his story. It wasn't my story. He had created the base of that story. So when I wrote that book, I climbed into my father and I said, I'm going to actually go and try to understand, not justify, but understand who my father was. What were the ingredients? What went into making him who he was, that he could rape and batter his own daughter? Like, what happened on that journey that would allow that? And it was excruciating, and it was liberating, and it was daunting, and it was painful. It was painful to feel for my father. It was painful to have empathy for my father, because I had monsterized him. I had otherized him. But at the end of that book, there's a line at the very end which says, "Old man, be gone." And I don't know if my father wrote it or I wrote it, because the minute I started writing that book, my father, that ancestor, arrived, and he wrote that book with me. And I know my father was liberated into another realm after that book was done, but I was liberated, because what I realized at the end of that book is I'm now in my world. This is my life. And this is my idea of what life is. And I lived many, many, many years of this particular life in his paradigm, and now I'm living mine. And what that means is, and I hate to keep using rape as a metaphor, but I feel we're in a state of rape right now. It's ongoing dominance, invasion, occupation, ripping apart, destruction, annihilation, where you just feel you're constantly being taken. And like, how do we heal from rape, right? How do we heal from rape? Well, first we have to acknowledge the truth of it, that we are being raped, right? And not pretend this feels good, not pretend we're okay with this, not pretend the fact that you can just one day go to 70,000 federal workers and say, you're done. And by the way, you're scum. All the years of your service, you're done, you're finished, right? That we can suddenly decide we're going to abduct Venezuelans and just throw them in a prison in El Salvador and do whatever we want to them for all of eternity with nobody intervening on their behalf, right? Like, this does not feel good. It does not feel good to look on your phone every day and see babies beheaded and crescent workers be bombed. And it feels awful. And we're all living in that world. And so we're being raped daily. So part of it is acknowledging it And then we have to find the moment where what was that particular rape that got you disconnected from yourself and from the world? What was the moment where you became disconnected? Where were you? What happened? What was it when you absolutely lost your way and became manipulatable? When you became able to be tossed and turned in the currents of predatory patriarchy, racist, imperialist capitalism. And then you have to really ask yourself, do I want to come back? Do I want to take this journey back? Because it's a very painful journey. It's also amazing. It's also beautiful. It's also terrifying, but it's the point of our existence here, right? And then what are the tools of my journey back? So I have many tools. I mean, I think there are types of therapy that are really important. I think that expanding our consciousness through plant medicine is critical. I think dancing, 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 dancing. I mean, more that we dance, the more that we begin to land in our bodies. And then to really face how deeply we are attached to our victimhood, right? Each one of us has been victimized by something, someone at some point. And that becomes us. That becomes our identity. That becomes who we are. And to give that up means you might actually not know who you are for a while, or maybe never again. And does it really matter if we know who we are? That's just some narcissistic, you know, thing that we engage in. Who am I? Who cares? Who cares? We're in the evolutionary moment where we're becoming ourselves as we are here. And to land on ourselves to say, this is me, seems utterly boring and flat and American, right? So I think really, and then the last thing I would say is like, build your earthship, find your tree, lay down in the ground, ask the mother to remake you. Ask the mother to rebuild you. Ask the mother to heal the cells in you that have been broken and tortured and done. And she will do it, I promise you, if you give yourself to her fully.
Mm. Can I just jump off this identity point and also clarify with conscientious objector? I'm not saying that's an end state.
No, I know, I got what you were saying. I did, yeah.
That you know, part of the recognition and the facing comes to identity, right? And if we believe our food is coming from the grocery store and our water comes from the tap, we're going to defend the life-destroying system, right? We're going to keep singing the death song that ensures the meta crisis. And so that disidentification is part of the dissolution of a broader identity, right? If you think you're a successful capitalist or an entrepreneur or even a social entrepreneur or what have you, you're limiting your identity because we are multidimensional beings. And identity is the problem, especially in a narcissistic culture. And it doesn't mean we bypass identity, but we also cannot abdicate our responsibility for fully feeling what is happening to other beings. And that requires empathy and compassion and sacrifice and the dissolution of and transcension of subject-object distinctions, right? The idea of subject-object in the dominant Western discourse and in the ontology that I described is the notion that I am the subjective experiencer and everything else is the objective other. But all mystical traditions, whether that's Sufism, Taoism, indigenous cultures, esoteric Buddhism, the whole practice is the dissolution of identity by any means necessary, whether that's whirling dervish dance, time in silence and isolation in the forest, psychedelics, ceremonial rituals, rites of passage, mantra, yantra, tantra, what have you. And that was always the aim of culture, right? Was to create these moments where you would draw the line in the sand and say, this is what I stand for. This is how I'm going to die to my old self to be in service to the collective whole and the entelechy of the broader ecology. And we don't have that in the West, right? We're bereft of elders, of rites of passage, of initiation. And in some ways, the aim is not to hope and pray for some nostalgic yesterday where that existed, but to claim our identity, right? To create bioregional sovereignty, to create post-capitalist communities like Tamara and others. And that is spiritual political praxis. And no one is going to do that for us. We're not in a culture that has institutions we can trust, clergy, media, governments, political leaders, right? They have all succumbed to the incentive landscape of greed and extraction and accumulation. And so we're going to have to do that ourselves. And that is not an individual task, that is communal sport.
And just to speak to that, I think so much of what happened in our left, quote unquote, is that when the left became corporatized and when the left became about resources and getting resources and then it became competitive and then it became all of that, like spirit left, right? And so what we have to do is understand that there's nothing we do in our activism that isn't spirit based. And that if we don't bring that back into the work that we're doing, we still are in this corporate model that will just mirrors what we are in theory are against. And I think we're last night I was at a really amazing meeting where we're really beginning to envision with Cori Bush as one of our leaders, like what would a movement for freedom look like? And how would we treat each other and be with each other that wouldn't be the way we've been with each other as a collective idea, right? And what would we be doing where we wouldn't be depending on that patriarchal system that colonializes and spreads its imperial will and has has sent so many bombs to destroy so many people around the world. Like, what would it mean if we pull away from that and say, no, it has to be whole. It can't be a little bit of this and a little bit of that. It's the whole story has to be the story. We can't accept that anymore. That's not acceptable. And what would it mean for us to then say we have to be the creators? We have to be the ones who determine our destinies collectively, locally, in our families, and live in a way that mirrors what we truly feel, and not say we're going to adapt, but instead we're going to regenerate, we're going to restore, we're going to build something whole. That's what I think is so remarkable about your film is like, we keep adapting. I'm watching this country right now. The capitulation is astounding. Adaptability. We're adapting. We're turning in names. We're giving up people. We're shutting down discourse. We name it. We don't want to adapt. I'm not adapting to this. I'm refusing to adapt. I'm going for the whole story or nothing. And I think we have to make that commitment now. Now is the moment, ironically, to make that commitment. Because even if we die in the process, our souls will have cleaned up something so big in our DNA that the next generation, or this, can I tell you this amazing statistic I learned, or this fact I learned this week? Okay, the cherry blossom tree and the mouse. Okay, the mice were eating the cherry blossom trees, and they wanted to stop them because they were eating all the cherries. So they did electric shocks on them, right? And that generation of mice stopped eating the cherry blossoms. The next generation of that same family of mice never ate the cherry blossoms. It took 7 generations for the first mice to go back to the cherry tree. So if we want to understand the depth of our indoctrination, it is profound. So if you break that cycle in your lifetime, your DNA now has changed. And the next people who reincarnate will not have that DNA. So even if we die, it doesn't matter. It's giving ourselves solely to this project. That's my feeling.
Wow, there's so much in this last hour. Yeah, so grateful for the two of you to spend this time here, for sharing with us, with our listeners, and also for this powerful work that you've been doing for such a long time to let life move through you in such an unreserved way. And yeah, for the powerful reminder and this call for revolution and regeneration instead of adaptation. That was very powerful. And yeah, I also just want to remind people that if you want to see Water is Love, the documentary that we've just released, that is through waterislovefilm.org, and you can now watch it for free on donation.
Yeah, thank
Thank
you
you.
so
Thank you
much.
for
Thank
having
you
me.
so much, both of you, and Emily and Martin. Just you've created a really beautiful, beautiful work, and everyone should see it. It's really important.
Yeah, thank you so
Love
much.
you, Alnoor.
Thank you
I
so
love
Yeah.
you all. I know Alnoor better.
Thanks so much.